The forest surrounding the outpost was ancient, its towering trees wrapped in a constant shroud of mist. It felt alive, as if the trees leaned in closer when no one was looking, their gnarled branches whispering secrets through the heavy air. The air was damp, heavy, with the smell of moss and decay. Corporal Daniel Reese adjusted his jacket, shivering as the chill bit through the fabric. He hated night watch, especially here, where the dense forest seemed to close in on him with every passing hour. The outpost itself was small, barely manned by 6 soldiers. Officially, they were there to monitor the area for illegal logging, but nothing ever happened. Days blurred together into monotonous routines, broken only by the unnerving stillness of the forest at night. It was during one of these long, uneventful nights that Reese first noticed it, a tree standing apart from the others. Its bark was gnarled and dark, and its twisted branches clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. What struck him most was the hollow in the trunk, a deep cavity that bore an unsettling resemblance to a human face. At first, Reese dismissed it as a trick of the light. The moon's glow, filtered through the mist, often played strange games with shadows. But the more he stared, the clearer it became. The face was disturbingly detailed, sunken eyes, a crooked nose, and a mouth frozen in a silent scream. Reese's breath hitched, and his pulse quickened. A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck as he stepped back instinctively, his fingers tightening around his rifle. He swallowed hard, a gnawing dread curling in his stomach. He nudged his fellow guard, Private Miller. "You see that?" Reese whispered, pointing toward the tree. Miller squinted, his breath fogging in the cold air. "What? It's just a tree." "No, look at the hollow," Reese insisted. It looks like a face." Miller stared for a moment longer, then shrugged. "You're tired? It's nothing." But Reese couldn't shake the feeling that it was something. He'd seen plenty of strange things in his time in the military, but nothing that left a knot of unease like this. That night, Reese's sleep was restless, plagued by vivid dreams of the tree. In his dreams, the face moved, its hollow eyes blinking, its mouth forming words he couldn't hear. He woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. The following night, Reese was back on watch. He couldn't stop himself from glancing at the tree, his eyes drawn to it like a moth to a flame. It seemed closer than before, though he knew that was impossible. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Then came the whispers. Reese's breath caught in his throat, his mind racing through every possible explanation. Was it the wind, or something older, something waiting? Reese's heart pounded in his chest, and a cold sweat prickled at his skin. At first, he told himself it was the wind shifting through the trees. But there was no wind. He strained to listen, convincing himself it was his imagination. But the words, soft, insistent, unintelligible, seemed to curl around him like tendrils of mist. Faint at first, like the sighing of wind through branches. But there was no wind. The sound grew louder, distinct words forming, though in a language Reese didn't recognize. He gripped his rifle tightly, scanning the area, his breath quickening. "Miller," Reese hissed, his voice trembling. Miller's reply was groggy. "What is it now?" "Listen." Miller frowned, his head tilting as he strained to hear. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, as if on cue, the whispers returned. Miller's face paled. "You hear it, don't you?" Reese said, his voice barely above a whisper. Miller nodded, his hand hovering near his sidearm. What the hell is that? Neither of them could answer. The whispers seemed to encircle them, coming from all directions. Reese felt his pulse pounding in his ears, a cold sweat forming along his hairline. His grip tightened around his rifle, his knuckles whitening. Miller's breathing grew shallow, his eyes darting around the darkness, muscles tensed as if ready to bolt. The oppressive silence that followed was almost worse, pressing down on them like an unseen weight. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. The next morning, Reese decided to inspect the tree in daylight, though a part of him screamed against it, as if stepping closer would bind him to something ancient and unrelenting. He approached it cautiously, his boots crunching on the damp forest floor. Up close, the face was even more detailed. The hollow eyes seemed to follow his movements, and the faint metallic temps in the air was stronger here. He reached out, his fingers brushing the rough bark. It was colder than he expected, almost icy. A shiver ran through him, and he pulled his hand back. That's when he noticed it. The ground around the tree was bare, devoid of leaves or moss. The other trees in the area were surrounded by thick undergrowth, but this one stood in a perfect circle of barren earth. Reese, Miller called from a distance. What are you doing? Checking it out, Reese replied. Don't, Miller said firmly. Just leave it alone. Reese hesitated, then nodded, stepping back. But as they returned to the outpost, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. Reese and Miller weren't the only ones to hear them. The other soldiers reported the same strange sounds, though none could agree on what they said. Some claimed it was a warning, others a plea for help. Then came the dreams. One by one, the soldiers reported vivid nightmares of the tree. In their dreams, the face moved, its mouth opening wide to reveal an endless void. When they woke, they found themselves drenched in sweat, their bodies trembling. By the third night, Reese had had enough. We need to report this, he told Miller. Something's not right. But when they tried to contact their superiors, the radio emitted only static. The landline was dead, and their vehicles wouldn't start. They were trapped. That night, Reese awoke to the sound of footsteps. He grabbed his rifle and crept toward the source. The other soldiers were already gathered near the edge of the forest, their faces pale and eyes wide. What is it? Reese asked. Miller pointed. The tree was gone. In its place was a shallow pit, the earth freshly turned. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. And then, from the depths of the forest, came the sound of creaking wood slow, deliberate and moving closer. The soldiers never spoke of what happened next. By the time a rescue team arrived, the outpost was deserted. No bodies were found, but the forest had grown thicker, the trees standing closer together, their twisted branches reaching skyward like outstretched arms. Among them was a new tree, its bark dark and gnarled, with a hollow in the trunk shaped like a screaming face. The air around it felt denser, as if the forest itself had drawn closer, watching, waiting. The shadows around it seemed deeper, as if the forest itself were leaning in, watching, waiting. And in the stillness, if one listened closely, faint whispers could be heard, drifting through the air like echoes of a long-forgotten warning.